Institute of Language Studies and Research, Kolkata, is a research establishment focusing on cultural studies, translation, post-colonialism, gender studies, and such various other domains in the Southeast Asian perspective. As a part of our research endeavors here, we regularly hold invited lectures at Institute of Language Studies and Research. Today, we gather for one such special lecture by Eleanor Marcussen. Today's lecture tracks through nature, infrastructure, and socio-ecological change by Eleanor Marcussen. Let me introduce you to our speaker today. Eleanor Marcussen is a researcher in history in the Department of Cultural Sciences and member of Linnaeus University Center for Concurrences in Colonial and Postcolonial Studies, LNUCC. She is the program coordinator of the Master's Program in Colonial and Postcolonial Studies. She joined LNU as a postdoctoral fellow in 2018. From 2019 and 20, she was an MWK co-fund fellow at the Max Weber Center for Advanced Cultural and Social Studies, Max Weber Kolleg Erfurt, at the University of Erfurt. Before joining LNU, Marcussen taught world history as an assistant professor in history in the North-South University, Dhaka, Bangladesh, 2017 to 2018. Marcussen holds a PhD in South Asian history from Heidelberg University, Germany, where her doctoral research was conducted in the research group Cultures of Disaster Shifting Asymmetries Between Societies, Cultures, and Nature from a Comparative, Historical, and Transcultural Perspective in the Cluster of Excellence, Asia and Europe in a Global Context, funded by the German Research Council. She has received several scholarships and fellowships as a doctoral student, among them being a junior research fellow at the School of Ecology and Environment Science Studies at the Nalanda University in Bihar and New Delhi 2013 to 14. Her book, Acts of Aid, Politics of Relief and Reconstruction in the 1934 Bihar Nepal earthquake examines the organization of relief and reconstruction work by civil society and the state of India in the 1930s. The socio-political history on the aftermath of the 1934 Bihar Nepal earthquake explores disaster aid, relief, and reconstruction and the questions they give rise to about class, communities, and inequality. The book traces disaster responses across the 20th century in order to demonstrate how they were embedded in political processes transcending the event of the earthquake. Aid, relief, and reconstruction mirrored political agendas and ideas that articulated both changes and continuities by the colonial state, civil society, and international organizations. The impact of the earthquake and aid in its wake varied widely according to social groups, ethnicity, and gender in the aftermath. By studying the effects of the earthquake on communities directly affected the society, Eleanor Marcussen argues that we can come closer to an understanding of the role political, social, and cultural factors held in shaping resilience to natural disasters. This title is also available as open access on Cambridge Core. In the field of historical disaster research, her interests include the perceptions of risk, the introduction of new building technologies, humanitarianism, and the politicization of disasters. Please welcome Eleanor Marcussen. And also ask our director, Dr. Shadiku, to now felicitate the speaker. Thank you, Madam Director. Now we can proceed with the topic.
Thank you very much for this warm introduction. Thank you very much for this warm introduction. And many thanks to the director, Professor Swati Guna, for inviting me and also accommodating me in your very busy schedule. Am I audible or should I? Yeah, okay, good. And also many thanks to all of you for coming here to listen to me today. This is indeed a very busy time of the year, as we know, the researchers, and I also know in Kolkata the book fairs and other events are on the schedule. So I'm very thankful to the Institute and the staff for here for facilitating my talk today. So let me start by saying, just as you heard in the introduction, that I'm a historian specialized in South Asian history. And I did my PhD at the South Asia Institute at Heidelberg University. I have a long-standing research interest in environmental history. As you heard, primarily through my research on disasters, and specifically so the construction of the disasters and the longer aftermath, both, or should I say, the reconstruction and relief processes, how we encounter it in the political history, but also theoretical ideas around the construction of what is risk and disasters in different cultures and different settings. So I worked in a research group for quite a few years on both images of disasters as well as the cultural history of disasters. And now I'm slightly shifting grounds towards more long-term socio-ecological processes, but it's still the interest in environmental history that drives my ideas that goes into this project. And I also looking forward to comments from all of you because there's truly an interdisciplinary project where I try to include also more STS perspectives and ideas about infrastructure as integrated into social history perspective. I also know from colleagues in literature and languages department, but there's a lot to gather from literary sources when it comes to infrastructure studies. And the infrastructural turn in the social sciences has also had a huge impact on the humanities, as some of you may know. I also know, for example, from Dr. Shwati, who has a recent conference visit here, it also comes into the studies on in gender studies, for instance, infrastructure. We have people as infrastructure is another theme, not just built infrastructure, but infrastructures of nature's infrastructures of human beings. So there's surely a lot of intersecting ideas there. So I should also mention, as I heard in the introduction, that I'm in post-colonial studies, and where I also gather a lot of inspiration from comparative colonial histories, and that goes into, for example, in northern Sweden, there's a lot of research on how infrastructures have helped to build the nation state by acquiring land and access to tribal areas, what is now called Lapland as a part of Sweden, but originally they called the Sapmi territories. And we have also now reverted to calling it Sapmi, territories of Sami people. So there also we see these infrastructural expansions as a way of acquiring land and governance infrastructures over not just land but over people too. So there's a lot to gather, and this I should say is also not just Sweden. That's a national territory, but it stretches across parts of Norway, Finland, as well as into Russia. So that is one side of being in colonial and post-colonial studies that I think has not so far inspired my previous work, but increasingly is doing so at the center. So let me start my PowerPoint. Should I just close down this one? Thank you very much. So this is just let me introduce. This is my new project that I'm presenting here, and by new I mean it's not the same as my previous project. And I haven't publish anything directly from this project yet, so I'm very much in favor of comments. I have a chapter which I'll come back to here which I wrote as a postdoc, and my current project is building up on those ideas that I gathered. So, texture, nature, infrastructure, and socio-ecological change is the bigger title of my project. So I'm just here today presenting some inferences and ideas that I have discussed in a couple of conferences. I mean, this is more like a working paper than a proper lecture of my accumulated research over a long time. And the project is running until 2025, so I'm a bit more than midway into it. But as you know, it was also the time of the pandemic, so some of my research in the archives was severely delayed. I basically kicked it off in 21 when we had quite a rough situation both in Sweden as well as in the UK and India in terms of access to resources. And I just came back from a visit to the Mumbai archives, the Maharashtra State Archives at the Elphinstone College in Mumbai. So I gathered some new sources that I haven't included here, but it's also on the expansion of infrastructure in terms of extracting coal that would then feed the railway, right, in order also to change the circulation of natural resources that naturally came or was driven by the expansion of the railways. Especially in those areas that I'm going to present on here today, which is Western Khandesh and Berar, which I think to this audience are quite well-known areas in present-day Maharashtra and central provinces. This image we have here is a slide from the Great Peninsula Railway that when it was being built, one of those photo albums that document the stretch from Borega into the inlands of Umravati and Rosavaldas railway points, but also the cotton district that was expanded in Western Khandesh and Berar. So let me start by an extract from a letter, which is sort of meant to set the scene about the sources that we find in the government correspondence when it comes to laying out the railway. Some of these surveys you might think are early in terms of the railways, but it goes back to the 1840s and 1850s. When it comes to the planning of the railway in this region. So this is in 1861 when the railway has already started being built in this region. Sorry, is it so small? So this is a curious thing that the water in Berar Valley should be generally so bad as this. When warm, the water is clear, but the taste of it greatly resembles tea water. The whole valley was originally covered with a low bubble of bushwood, and in almost all cases, the water found in Berar, where this bubble tree jungle prevails, is salty and brackish. This bubble bushwood, with the exception of patches here and there, having been chased away, the ground sown with cotton, linseed, which are the two paying crops, wheat and sorghum are also sown. Grass is not obtainable; it does not grow in this bubble tract. This too he had was near the dikes. This point is of course added to the bad quality of the water. The valley being unsuitable for troops, but especially for cavalry. Kurki is the grass hat, which is very expensive. This is owing to the great manufacture of cotton in Berar. In the whole valley under cultivation, and the babu jungle chased away, wood, which is another great demand, is very rare and scarce. The line of railway passes by Mulkapur and Akola on to Omravati. I cannot say much for the progress they have made. Mr. Lee, the contractor, told me he experienced the central difficulty is obtaining coolies. The coolie hire in this part of the country is 2 annas a day for a man. Mr. Lee dogs aren't paid by the day, but by the amount of work done, and I understand his salary, that a man could easily earn 8 annas a day. So this extract in several ways narrate the environmental issues and transformations from the colonial officer's perspective when the railway expansion began. It highlights the ecological difficulties experienced in terms of extending the railways in this particular area. The scarcity of water, the scarcity of grass is one issue that the colonial officers experienced in terms of crossing the land and accessing the land. And of course, the expansion of cash crops, cotton and linseed, are very familiar in the historical literature, and this area is known for the expansion of the railways in the 1860s due to the cultivation of cotton. Right? But it also then reflects the labor situation, which some of my colleagues have come back to that later have written extensively about, based on an archive, contextualized of course, but based on an archive at the News University, the Joseph Stevens archive, that some of you may have heard of before. But in general, these dimensions and expectations here are things that recur in the literature of in the colonial archive very much in terms of difficulties. And again, the the availability of wood for different purposes, for construction and so forth, is also extremely familiar when we talk about the railways in India. The whole protection of forests, for example, came up as a result, as we have seen in the literature of railways. So these are the thematics that go into it. But then, so what does infrastructures do, and especially then large infrastructures, you may ask? I'm, however, interested not just in the larger infrastructure, but also in the smaller changes that we see in the local societies here. What do they do in terms of ecological relations, how people relate to the nature and the environment around us? In this paper here then today in my presentation, I discuss some of these cases that I find on how infrastructure impact local communities in terms of transforming land access and mobility specifically. And as I will come back to, of course, infrastructure facilitates mobility, but it also changes access to the landscape. We are quite familiar with this in our present day society also in terms of embankments, for example. It's a recurrent issue. Or in terms of intersecting infrastructures, railways, canals, and also, of course, roads, how it comes together and facilitates access to new areas. But here I'm focusing specifically on water and land in terms of mobility. And in today's energy and transport transition towards sustainable mobility of goods and people, railways are, of course, considered to be one of the best options, if not the best options. But at the same time, if we look at historical studies, they underline the adverse effects of the construction of railways, how it has impacted land use, how it has changed ecologies and land livelihoods also in terms of labor relations. We see that in India, where we have a struggle between the public work departments and also the railway construction, as well as the daily wage labor for agricultural labor. So this is also something we see in the historical literature that we also see, right, which also see in my research, but I don't dwell much on the whole labor discussion, simply because it is, what should I say, a big side discussion, and it's a huge topic in itself that is economic history more than what I'm interested in. So we can also see that this extraction, of course, was the expansion of the railways was based on the extraction of export of raw materials, but also the planning of military and financial interests, of course. If we come back to what I mentioned before, the comparative studies in colonialism, but also infrastructures and nationalism, there have been similar studies on, for example, nationalist territorial expansions in the Nordic countries, interestingly enough, but not more importantly, maybe in this case, British imperial expansion of railways in the colonies reflected visions of imperial ambitions for trade, profits, and different connections. Planning of national infrastructure projects involve these larger political choices and discourses that we see also here in my research. Planning of national infrastructure projects in the British imperial context, the colonial government's use of railways for governance and resource extraction is now fairly uncontested. This is also well established in the literature. But of course, we saw before that there was a colonial narrative of the railways as a boom and as a source of progress and economic growth, especially before and after the famine. So this was also a shift in literature where we first had this idea, the colonial narrative of infrastructure, and then after that another history writing, which was more critical, especially on the use of timber, for example, and the forest extraction that came with the railways. I'm, however, as I mentioned before here, inspired by some of the environmental and technological understandings of infrastructure. There is the scholar called Thomas Steller, who argues that infrastructure remains deeply embedded in non-human environment and often create new environmental contexts. And simply put, he means that infrastructures changes, the infrastructures together with human beings changes the environment that we have in certain ways. And with the environment, it doesn't necessarily mean nature, right? It's the social environment that we live in, and the circuits, how we move and what we do changes with it. So when large-scale infrastructure enters into relationship with the environment, what are these new different measures of human and non-human nature? And at the same time, infrastructure studies then in the larger context can tell us more about people and nature, how they work, and how they form infrastructures. I mentioned before, for example, Simon's paper, People as Infrastructure, which has been quite influential also. So I wish to explore these effects of infrastructure based on some of these ideas. I would say, I think, move on to, yeah. So I mentioned some of these. Somehow I feel like it's perhaps a bit of a redundant literature to many of you who are familiar with the historical context of India very well, or South Asia. But of course, the dominant position in social history sees infrastructure development in social, cultural, and ideological terms as this form of tools to consolidate imperial power. That is how infrastructure has been often narrated in the historical literature. That the colonial government, with collaborators to a great extent, and used infrastructure as a tool for accessing power, resources, and of course also then gaining financial capital. So Henrik Thies's Tools of Empire from 1981 spearheaded this historical narrative very much. And then again, Henrik's Power Over Peoples from 2010 also continued this as the title of course, Power Over Peoples. But also it continued it, but it also shifted focus to the environmental factors that also appropriated but also limited the different ways that infrastructure could work. And we also have David Arnold's work on environment, society, and technology. Henrik's later work also took up this colonial perception of how progress, nature, and scientific advances shaped and to a great extent developed when it encountered non-European environments. And there's also this idea then that the colony was a great, served as a great experiment to develop some of these technologies later on in the Middle East and in Europe. So again, a tool that went beyond just being a tool, of course, in the setting of South Asia. Henrik's and others' work criticized the earlier claim that railways are successful transfers of what is perceived as Western knowledge, technology, and innovation, all neutral to social circumstances. So now, when the railways are to some extent researched as a part of the larger colonial project, political and social histories in particular have tried to show how technology operated in situated specific contexts. And that's also where my work, I hope, will make an impact. Um, Whether roads, electricity, dams, or telegraph lines, research have focused on control, power, and research extraction, but less so on environmental consequences brought on by the infrastructures in their own right. In particular, the innovations in and expansions of infrastructure in Britain and the colonies were of primary importance for its networks of power. Environmental consequences of imperialism remain analyzed as the outcome of the raw materials exploited, while the railways, which enable the expansion of trade and communications, rarely feature as part of the analysis. Um, Instead, environmental historians have found deforestation to be the major environmental consequence of the railways in terms of demand for wood, for sleepers, as well as for fuel. Um, I would also like to mention the work by Ritika Prasad, for example, Tracks of Change, where she also discusses the floodwater impact of embankments. So it's also the nexus of different disasters, like natural disasters, as they were interpreted, but of course, socially construction through the construction of the railways and roads. Her focus is, however, slightly later. In the 1990s, for example, she gives example of this breaking of railways in Bihar, the embankments of the railways because they caused great flooding. I see the same in the 1934-35, for example, when the land changed. There were also breaking of embankments because of the flooding that was in the outlet. So this is something that comes up and is not so, of course, prominent in the 1960s because these are the very first years of the railway in that area, which I'm talking about the research. But similar to other parts of the world, railway companies in India, they utilize the embankments as cost-effective mechanisms for dealing with substantial changes in gradients as well as for laying tracks across low-lying delta areas with uneven terrain. Problems, of course, arose with these drainage outlets. For example, McAlpin, also in her research, have highlighted the increase in malaria in connection with railways and road construction because of the stagnation of water that comes with it. So I would say that social histories of railways in South Asia have definitely highlighted this local effect of infrastructure and how it impacts livelihoods and life in villages and communities. More recently, we also have Devjani Bhattacharya's Empire and Ecology in the Bengal Delta, the making of Kolkata, which I assume even you are familiar with as we speak here in Kolkata. But also, for example, Rohan D'Souza's work, Damned and Drowned, and not the least, Iftikhar Iqbal's environmental history of the Bengal Delta, which also switches into Bangladesh. While Rohan D'Souza then, of course, focuses on the recent. But again, this is the same idea that we have this construction of certain infrastructures, whether it is railways and dams and canals and so forth, but it still has intersects with how local life progresses or it is left. And a very interesting book, very recently, or 2015, was published by Palanitas, Colonialism, Development, and the Environment, Railways and Deforestation in British India from 1860 to 1884. And I think that book is hugely helpful also. Although, of course, she focuses on the deforestation, which is a major topic when we talk about environmental issues and railways. We have another one by Rita Bambi, the Great Indian Peninsula Railway, which my research also really relies upon to a great extent because it is really the railway stretch that I am focusing on also, although she's not taking an environmental focus. And then we also have Ganesh Nayak has edited a volume on called The Railways in Colonial South Asia, Economy, Ecology and Culture, which also then in an interdisciplinary manner touches upon railways and ecology, which I find also very interesting in bringing out certain perspectives that I might not have found from purely historical literature. And towards the end, I would also like to mention Aparajita Mukhopadhyay's Imperial Technology and Native, within brackets, agency, a social history of railways in colonial India, 1850s to 1920, where she also then brings in these local perspectives on the railways. So again, a great social history of how railways impacted local societies and can be written into social history. Um, there are also more, as I mentioned before, comparative colonial world, and let me just mention two here. Marcussen from 2019 has written Empire's Tracks, Indigenous Nations, Chinese Workers, and the Transcontinental Railroad, which again is this comparative focus on infrastructure and imperialism. The last one I would like to mention here is from North Scandinavia by Laura Junka IQ, whose settler colonial state, Arctic Railway, state transformation, and settler self-indigenization in northern Finland. And this is again this idea of the expansion of the railways into territories of settlement and the question of who is the local and who is the settler and the different people that get access to certain areas because of infrastructure. So, and I briefly touched upon some of the SDS studies, and I'm not going into that here, but I mentioned rather, I would say, the main influence in terms of South Asian history that has influenced me in writing environmental and social history. So, to sum up this brief part of the introduction, Borregat is perhaps one of the most famous parts of this stretch, the GFR as it is called in abbreviation. And it is one of those, experiments where there were some large-scale built constructions that was, all in photographs and, unparalleled in British constructions in terms of scale and scope. You might not see it so clearly here, but the number of people that went into the construction is quite mind-boggling only from the photos, and there are, of course, a lot more people behind the scenes, right? But this part is, of course, not what is, I think, the most interesting, but rather the smaller everyday railway constructions, the smaller railway sites, for example, relatively small, I should say, because they're quite differential, like Bosabon, for example, at the railway hub, or Akola and Umravati, because of the cotton market. But in terms of railway literature, so to say, they are minor compared to the Borega. So what I'm interested in, then I look at the water access, capital, labor, and construction material, spaces for local perspectives on resources, and also this entangled relationship that is created when it comes to the main traveler on the railway in this period in the 1860s, 65, which is the cotton and linseed. Right? It is not the persons that are in focus when it comes to the expansion of the railways. It's not transport for people we're looking at here. It is transport of materials and making them more efficient road for the cotton to reach the farmers in next slide, please. So I'll just flip back to what I mentioned at the beginning, the Joseph Stevens archives, where I spent 1 year as a postdoc working on the project on the circulation of knowledge and resources. And very interestingly, and perhaps surprising to many, Joseph Stevens was a contractor at this very stretch in India. He came from Copenhagen. He was an Anglo-Scandinavian person. British parents were born and raised in Stockholm and Copenhagen, so his English wasn't quite perfect. I know for sure. I've had a correspondence. And he made a fortune as a contractor, as a very efficient subcontractor, and then a contractor in his own right. And he returned to Sweden. I mean, they didn't return to Sweden because his family was based in Copenhagen, but he knew of the investments through his godfather in southern Småland, where also the Linnaeus University is based, where I am presently researcher. So interestingly, he went with his brother-in-law, and his brother-in-law was an engineer, a proper engineer, working first on railways in between Roskilde and Copenhagen in Denmark, where he then met Joseph's sister, and this was a very convenient match, because Joseph then could follow his brother-in-law to India as a contractor when the brother-in-law was transferred. So in 1859, he set sail for India, and 1816 to 68, if I'm not wrong, he spent, 69, he returned the last time from India. He went and bought his estate in between, invested his money, the fortune he had made in this estate, which he bought also thanks to that being the last famine years in Sweden, the Great Famine year in 66-67. So the prices went down, and he was able to afford to buy this great estate with the money made in India. And it's also interesting that afterwards, which I have written quite a bit about, he was one of the forerunners in building the railway in southern Sweden in order to export natural resources from southern Sweden to imperial harbors, to the British Empire. So he learned a lot in India, not just in terms of engineering training, because he trained to become a civil engineer, but more so interestingly, we learned about the trade routes and the value of natural resources at certain points, of course, in this period. So I have spent quite some time then personally on this postdoc working on some of the sources in this archive, which has also been explored by many other researchers in terms of looking at labor contracts, because Joseph then had collected and brought with himself a huge chest with papers of the contracts that he made with the labor gangs in Angola and so forth, in Calais in the 1860s. This was found only in 2008 and catalog. So it was stored in this attic from 1867 until 67, 69, until 2008, and then it was found when we were cleaning out the attic, like full chest of papers that were then cataloged in university. So it's been quite a journey for these papers, and if we go to British Library or if I go to collections, for example, here, these kind of petty contractors, subcontractor papers are extremely rare to come by because you don't find these subcontractors in the colonial archives. There you have the contractors, big contractor names that often have offices in London or globally in the US. But these subcontractors were on much pettier standard and did the interaction. He spent his day riding across the plains and trying to find neighbors and setting contracts. So it's certainly a fortune maker who came out only 19 years old and sorry, next one. So this is some of the publications I just wanted to mention in connection with that project, and also Margareta Pettersson, a literature scholar who is now retired, has written on especially the women in the Stevens family, because Joseph's sister then also lived quite some time in India, and her husband then also the relations that they had in India and then returned to. the imperial underbelly, workers, contractors, and entrepreneurs in colonial India and Scandinavia, edited by Brenda Sedler, where I also had a chapter, and that was my part of my postdoc project. So in all these publications, you find some chapters on Joseph Stephen related, I would say, mainly labor history publications. And there you see then an example of the famous box that was sent back. There's an exhibition that we made at the at Fisher's Estate actually in 2019. So yes. So so as previous research has dwelled on at length, the construction of the railway was instrumentally and intrinsically linked to the export of raw materials and specifically cotton in the context of India in the 1860s. This cash crop agriculture expanded with the inception of colonial rule in western parts of India in the 1820s, for which the railways was meant to provide quick and affordable transport to the ports. In western India, where the railways was pushed ahead for commercial interest, deforestation had consequently begun 40 years before railways would facilitate even larger areas to be brought under cultivation. The implementation of the GIPR facilitated global trade by connecting the two most important metropoles in British India, Bombay and Calcutta, at the same time as it changed circulation and access to local resources and environments. Amalendra Guha has published Raw Cotton of Western India, 1750 to 1850s, which details this rerouting of transport links as the harbor in Bombay gained significance. Cotton cultivation and railway connections in Berar and Khandesh had been preceded by considerable experimentation with cotton seeds in Dharwar, more to the west in Bombay Presidency. Since 1835, experiments with American cotton seeds have been introduced, and being a curious failure to the colonial administration, explained by the lack of rain and alternative water resources. We can see here, maybe this is a bit blurry, this image, but you see here the great cotton fields of India supplying very little to England from one of the roads and the coast. Europe to the coast. So this is in the Chatham Papers, famous railway constructor from 1846 in the British Library. So in 1846, this was already on the map that they needed better railways to export the raw materials of India. And you, of course, you see the other, this is just one slice of it, but cotton is already then very important for the British Empire. No cotton you see just to the south, and then we have, of course, opium down there. Then we have further south again, good cotton, uncertain climate, very inferior cotton, etc. Right? So there, cotton is definitely on the map, literally, figuratively speaking. And there also you have inferior to English use and so forth, jungle, uncivilized tribes with invitation marks and so forth, right? So they are very particular in terms of the resources that can be extracted at this point of time. And the experiments then with Egyptian cotton began already in the 1830s, so this was on the map very early on. But in the 1860s then, we have also many things coming together. It was the Santal Rebellion, which is also very familiar to the audience here today, of 1855, and also the uprising, of course, of the so-called uprising for independence, 1857, which both suspended the construction, but also changed some of the construction, the idea of different towns and so forth. The East India Company was abolished and the British Crown took over. So there was a replanning that was done in the middle of this. Not the least, also the Suez Canal came up and opened in 1869, which would further facilitate this construction, right? So this infrastructure was a part of the larger network of infrastructure. we also see these curious extensions of the map which tell us something about the importance of water. So here is for the plans of railways and roads in the 1830s and the 1850s, and this is published in 1850, and only about 5 years after the previous line I showed you, where they have expanded by a little paper, fold-out paper, where the railways are supposed to go into Berar, right? So it was not even on the print to begin with. So quite interestingly, this is sort of like progressing of the idea of the railway as it is being made. Next. And as we can see here, then, sort of zooming in more and more on the map of the region which I'm working on, we have the contract maps. This is contract number 13, which Joseph Stevens worked on extensively, where we have the Umravati that I mentioned before, but also Shegan, where they built a gin press for transport, facilitating transport. And all of these smaller places along the railway line that we worked on, expanding them into Berar. And we can take the next one to show this the zooming in of the bigger colonial project, and then we have these more local maps where we find even more sources. And here we see that the Tapti River, just to situate where the railway would then be laid later on. So this is the military map from 1880, and the map you saw just before of the railway construction is then I drew it roughly, but couldn't say exactly, but pulled the red line here to see approximately how it goes with the rivers and the small tributaries in this area, because this is very important to understand also how the railway was planned according to water access, but also not destruction from the water. And you see, of course, now there is maybe a good landmark in terms of directions, because it's still, Umravati and Akkola are maybe not the most familiar places to everyone even today. And you see, Tapti River is, of course, and Barda River is, of course, also quite big ones that will also be important for the water access to the railway, which, because of course water was needed, but also not to obstruct or be obstructed by the water. Next. So I will give two examples here from what I've been looking at in terms of materials, and I would just also say that I have a table of contents that I will share in here because it's been very rough of the idea of my book project that will come out of this at the very end, with a few articles. But one of them is specifically then how labor and stone laying, not labor politics as such, but different stone techniques in terms of building railways, bridges, and viaducts and embankments come into it, because it's done by local labor and local materials that are also then sourced locally. And the other one would be on accessing water. Another chapter is on accessing water. Specifically, I'm looking at ecology and power, capital, and the nodes and networks that are created around water resources. And another chapter would then be more on the global grids and how infrastructure is connected locally to the global larger connections, which are for the first time. Briefly here also. Here we have the example then of capital accidents. One fatal accident occurred that is documented quite extensively in the archives and in the Maharashtra State Archives in the railway section. So The couple then walked up on the rails, and it resulted in the adoption of a new railway cattle guard to put in front of the engine, right, to block the animals from coming under. And it also resulted in the review of fencing in this on the stretch, which was because it was a recurrent problem with cattle attempting to cross the tracks for accessing water, right? So it's not just humans here, but it's also how cattle interact with the railways. Um, it was not just construction, of course, that would change the access by the for the cattle, but it would also be the management of villages here. The colonial government would say it's also the duty of the villages to herd the cattle instead of allowing them to roam freely. So the practice of cattle herding would also be impacted by the railway, right? The way that cattle are managed. Um, Another way would also be, and pointed out in connection with this accident, and we have following documents, would be to restrict the level of cattle, the number of cattle of the villages in certain areas where you have infrastructure. But along the railways, one of the primary methods, and perhaps not so surprising, would be fencing to keep the cattle off track, different forms of fencing. Also humans for that matter. I have not read much about the human accidents. Cattle will be much more prevalent, but there are instances of children, for example, rolling up on the tracks, very unfortunate accidents. But that would be on passages which have to be remain open. So this is more agricultural lands where the fencing would be put up. So from 1850s onwards, revenue survey operations served to encourage the spread of cultivation and regulate land tax. The same service also recorded flows and flow cattle by different communities, and especially tribal communities who work in agriculture in this region. So cattle rearing in Candesha Berar was gradually circumscribed by laws in the same period. So it's also not just the railways, of course, but it's also in general how communities are governed here. The surveys from the 1860s I have not looked up because I haven't found them, but from 1880s and 1890s there are quite extensive surveys from Jalgaon, Bosavan, and Pachora, these local places, towns, where we see the management of jungles and scrub jungles and cattle moving in these areas, so-called pastures for these lands. What would be used then as a type of as a material for fencing would be the rubber plants. But it was quite soon discontinued, and then we have the prickly pear was used as a fencing plant. And then, of course, we also have different wood. But the problem with wood would be that the white ants would come and eat it up, so it would be eroded quite fast. That's why live plants was mainly tried out for fencing operations in this area. In the end, even iron standards was put up in order to keep out cattle from crossing. I would also, as I mentioned here, Roland Debroy at Reading University has discussed this so-called informal politics or and political entomology from 2003 for Brown also. Rebecca Brown, I think is the where we see this shift again from a human-centered history to looking at animals in history, right? So to decenter the human and look at how animals like white ants, for instance, or cattle experience or intersect with this human narratives that we see are more prevalent. So that is also, I think, one way of seeing another perspective on the railways that can be quite useful. Maybe then through capital in my case, because that is what is most documented also. But I think there could be also scope for other literature perhaps that could shed some light on this. Next. The other part that I I've looked at is the construction materials and ecologies, because stones are concerned, of course, went in extensively, but very differently so depending on access to labor and materials, and this also affected the quality, but also more so the physical conditions, like for example, in 1863 on contract number 13 that I mentioned before with Joseph Stevens, um, where he did several parts. He had to change the whole design of the embankment because of the rising water levels and the miscalculations. Um, so this is also ways of seeing how different uh, labors and tools came into the construction of certain stretches. And way that if, for example, the construction material was more expensive in one area, the standard of the railways would go down. So large parts of, for example, this contract number 30 had to be redone after 1867, 68, 69, that year when it was reviewed again. So lacking quality in constructions and the materials was a recurrent problem. And you can see these are the local ways of constructing the foundations, right, for embankments, for instance. And these were all laid down in very strict schedules, like how you should mix the two of the different materials for fixing stones and so forth, right? The line, but it was barely ever followed exactly because of the saving-minded subcontractors wanted to maximize profit or the availability of materials and also, of course, impact the cost. Next. So as you can see here on this, also then again contract number 13, where I have a lot of material from Joseph Stevens. Is how the gradients would also then be adjusted according to the water courses. And this can also tell us something about how the local water flows was impacted by railways and access to water in these areas. And this again, then, if you had to raise the railways, you would need more materials, right? So you would quite often you would try to use as few materials as possible in the railway in order to minimize the cost. And I'm not saying that is like what affects the local communities here, but it's interesting to see because it becomes an interaction with the local labor and material, what is available, and what can be sourced for building the railway. Next one. Another way would, of course, be the planning of the stations, where we can see how, especially I think it's interesting to see the idea of security, but also the access to water that come in after 1857, after 1857 specifically. Because then, when I look at the bigger cities, for example, Jamalpur, which is of course not in this area, but it's a big junction point for this extension. The security becomes much more important after 1857 in terms of how to plan infrastructure and access of troops and access of water and access to the jails and the so-called native communities. So this also changes the idea of what is security and negotiation of should we be closer to water sources or should we consider the security of the facilities of governance. So this is also, I think you can see here how detailed the maps are in terms of marking wells and streams, like perennial streams or seasonal streams and so forth. Right? It is extremely detailed, specifically with the railways in mind. And you also need a lot of water for the engines on the railways. Right? So this is also taken into consideration that you need a good water source where you plan your station and the sidings of the railway, right, the platforms. And quite frequently, you would also have these packing stations nearby for the cotton or giving press and so forth. Right? So there are lots of things that need water and access to water, which then determine how it is planned. And you see also there the slightly slightly down in the on the right, you see the proposed tank, the well and proposed tank. So there are also like plans for future infrastructure that will aid water access. Mainly then, of course, as it is planned from this perspective of the railways. So let me come to just some concluding remarks. And slightly over time, perhaps. Or, okay. Yeah. What I mainly see from these sources, and this is of course a very tentative suggestion in terms of my research, and perhaps not so surprising, but if we should say local resistance or reluctance to infrastructure, when I look at specifically this stretch, then, which is again a very small part of the railway project, and very specific in terms of intersecting with this cotton boom of the 1860s, which I brings out with the Civil War and the Civil War, right? That's why they have this huge push for railways. Was access to land and most importantly then the water in this land, most prominently in connection with capital. What we can see, main secondary, I would say, and I will come back to that in just a second. Or maybe I should just mention it now because it is not directly related to water. It is the access of labor, which is the last point here. That labor, if you access the land, if you cut off land, you would also then slightly cut off labor from certain agricultural areas. So there would be some contestations about who should, if you build the railways in certain areas, can you bring labor from another region that would be interfering with the public works departments in other areas which are not connected to the railways. So this would not be like ecological as such, but if they accessing land through the railways would also then be impacting the labor relations on a much wider scale, which would then, I would say, indirectly be related to land use, right? How daily wage labor, for example, would be less paid if they work on agricultural land in the low season, but if it's high season, they would be more paid in the agricultural sector than by the railways in vice versa, right? So this is, of course, how people use the land can be directly influenced by the construction of the railway, but not necessarily the being of the railway as such, right? But it is more related to the construction. So what I plan to look more at, and I hope to dwell more on, is really the accessing of water in different ways and how that has changed with the construction of the railway and also the being of the railway, not just the construction as such, but the longer aftermath, where we see this access to land being circumscribed by the infrastructure in terms of not just railways, but also the roads and the feeder roads. Now, when I was at the Mumbai archives, also I looked at the coal extensions, for example, where it's also very interesting to see how certain companies are benefit from these constructions in the end, right? Like the companies that get access to coal extraction that would feed the railways. So these are also, of course, I would be interested to see if I could find more local sources on the construction, and because the mining sector is, of course, a very important also in relation to the railways. Thank you very much.
We now move on to the question and answer session. If anybody has some questions, ask.
But, I'm I'm Alek Mondul. I work as a for the ABC Resources as a part of our literary collaboration. I have two questions. Do you, I mean, do you find a pattern of displacement of communities in where or in the areas where the tracks were constructed? This is number one. And and my question number two is somewhat related to number one. Do you also prefigure the idea of ecological integration, which runs alongside with this topic? So I know the question is not very ordered, but if you could still shed some light on it. Thank
So your first question, in terms of displacement with the laying out of the railways, uh, yeah, I've seen quite a few documents on people moving or land being acquired by the railways for the construction or for uh, future uses. So land use is being disrupted, and the peasants and the landholders, I would say the landowners, I cannot remember on top of my head the exact name, but there's a certain category of landholders in this region which are paid off for not using the land for agricultural purposes. And there's also several cases where the land is, they can't find the landholders, or the land, they cannot track them down simply, where the land is just acquired. And but then there are these long correspondences of concerns about how what will happen in terms of, now it's gone 10 years, we have used this land without permission officially, and then try to put some, act into force or something to come around paying off the actual landowner in the end. And the other one you said ecological migration, or did I get you right? Yeah.
so if you, I mean, do you see a pattern of similitude in this aspect? So on or I'm just overstating. So
Um, I think there is a large labor migration for certain, but that is for, in the construction. I have not seen like a resettlement pattern or anything like that. I mean, there is in the historical literature, this shift in and out of this region for different purposes, from Berari to Western Cambridge, for example.
not any I can remember at this point. So
But
and not any I can remember at this point. So I used to study the history for quite some time with this, but I do not have a very exact clear picture of the thing. So yeah,
yeah,
all in a way.
no, I wouldn't say that I've seen any large scale migration because of the railway or displacement or in that sense, right? Like not whole communities being displaced. There is of course the issue of embankments, and so this would be shifting, shifting movements and so forth. That is definitely there. That the railway is cutting off, and you have to take another path for example, capital and communities uh, to access a village, for example. So that is a rerouting, but not like a displacement of people in the large scale. I know there is in the literature shift of people, seasonal, going from Berar up to Nagpur, for example, towards that area. But I haven't seen any connection with the railways in that sense.
Pardon, could you just allow one follow-up, please? But do you also see? I mean, you just spoke about the idea of labor and that sort of displacement you just talked about. If I understood right, if I understood that right. Do you also see a question of, I mean, I'm pretty sure that you have studied it in other parts of the world, that same phenomenon that happened there. The question is that do you see a pattern of religion and ethnicity in that aspect? Uh, I mean, do you see that a certain class? While we're speaking at the idea of labor, uh, do you see that there were a certain population of people which are connected in a sense of caste and that of religion, while we are speaking of the river displacement?
Uh, in terms of labor migration, there is quite a big literature on these construction workers on the railways, the stone setters, for example. So definitely, and also the certain tribal communities were used for construction in certain areas, and that's also a part of this labor literature, where I would say mainly in economic history, but quite a lot has been written from this postdoc project that I was part of by economic historian, for example, Giraj Naik at Ambedkar University. In literature, we had a postdoc, Alexander Buff, who wrote on contractors specifically. So he has written about the contractor in Bollywood cinema, as well as in literature, but as a bad person. But then also working on these archives, he has also written about the contractor of the 1860s. So he published an article in Modern Asian Studies about this, Alexander Buff.
I did it last week actually.
Oh, okay. I read it. Yeah, so there's a lot of quite interesting aspects on these the labor gangs that went into the construction of the railways, and of course you find in Joseph Stevens' archives these contracts where you have all these the list of names of women, children, workers, and different skills, and carpenters and stone setters of different classes and costs, and you can of course now also from the names then because the names are listed, and religion also comes in there, for example. I mean, we can see from the names quite often religious belonging, right? And yeah, that's what I
Thank you.
quite a lot. I think very interesting things in those publications I mentioned there, and also more from Radhika Krishna published an article which also teases out more the social history of the laborers, the relationships there, which is focusing less on wages, which Viraj is an economic historian. Take more, look at the shifts in how labor was negotiated. Why she looks more at the social relations between laborers and contractors and labor gang leaders. There is quite interesting points that have been lifted also from how the engineers and the contractors and the Europeans are sort of say sensitized to how to approach religion and respect these local workers' religious, practices and festivals, and give them bakshish when it is needed and so forth. They call it bakshish or some kind of money that for celebrations and so forth, provide special food, right? So that's a good thing. And Joseph Stevens even continues to use that word when he's in Sweden. So he really adopts it. Bakshish, we never understand it in a Swedish context, but it's completely taken from his time in India.
One of the reasons I think is because as of the policy which was, the policy which was carried out from British period to today is that when a land is acquired by the government for the construction of the railways, that land must be compensated at the minimum price, and that policy is somewhat still carried out today. I think with almost no modification. So it was also a way to to keep them happy momentarily and at the same time to keep them poor. Yes, that is also sort of thing. That is also that appeals to the psychology, but not to the class. That's
Thank you, Eleanor, for this wonderful presentation. Actually, your research prompts me to think so many things, but I will try to summarize that. And these are not the questions, these are some of my observations. Because you have talked about that land and water connection and the labor, what it took. I mean, if we say that Gyan Prakash was a founded histories, which is on South Bihar, that also talks about the social relations of water and how it works on the center in the question of servitude and that kind of this thing, I mean, the extraction. So what I think that important is infrastructure, socio-ecological change.
we should also talk about that extraction and communication. If we think about Nitin Sinha's work, he also talks about the communication aspect and what he was talking about. If I connect it, the land acquisition question and the railways, you can also see that article written by Sriti Kumar Sarkar that is on Bengal, that studies in history. So that we can do, yes.
Yeah.
Uh, for Bombay, I'm not much aware with that region, but you talked about the protection of the railway side of the infrastructure side. Ritika Prasad talked very little about that. So, but when we are talking about the Bengal in terms of Bengal and the embankment, if you see that Bengal embankment manual, there it is also a region over there that for protection it was their utmost superior. I mean, they paid so much attention to that, and if we say that labor who were participating in that infrastructural work, so not only being an economic historian, if we see through the perspective of environmental historian, as you have worked at the disaster. So disaster opened up that scope to participate in that infrastructural venture, which was also performed, I mean, guided by and inspired by that governmental initiative. Though it manifested in a different way, and social aspects, we say that the social relations, gender, the question of gender, caste hierarchy, that came up with a different phase of different notion in the wake of disaster and in the aftermath of the disaster. And what I would say that you have started with coal and that railway and deforestation was also there. There are so many words, needless to say, with a specific emphasis. But if we connect it, if we start it from coal, then we should say something about the geological survey of India, GSI, because GSI in its memoirs, voluminous memoirs are there, and it is mentioned over there in so many memoirs that how coal has been extracted, and that was also an infrastructural process. The discovery of coal, the marking that area, they were putting labor over there, and that started from the end of the 18th century. So when we are 18th century, I mean from 1770 to 78, that was also started in a very unorganizational way. But it was from the beginning of the 19th century, they were doing it in a more organizational way. And when GSI was started to venture in the field of earthquake research, that was more after 1850. So it was already so established that the communication connection railways. So coal, when they invented coal or oil, if I'm giving some example about that, when tea was invented in northern part of Bengal, Darjeeling, so how railway has been extended from now today's Bangladesh via Siliguri to Darjeeling, and for Assam, for coal and oil from Bangladesh to Assam via this Coach Bihar and northern Bengal, and Coach Bihar by that time was part of the British administration. So I mean, if we say that coal or oil, these things, they prompted or they inspired that ideologies of extraction, which had also some ecological issues also that incorporated the marginal people, marginalized people, that we have seen the British policies and the famines in Bengal, Odisha famine specifically, or Bengal, we have famine during the Damodar market. So there we should also keep in mind about that thing when coal-like things or oil that prompted the generation or the introduction of another step of infrastructure. I mean, coal, oil that was doing on the first half of the 19th century, bauxite and other things, and railways that came in the second half of the 19th century. So there was also some sort of ideologies of extraction that also guided the government initiative to build up infrastructure. So how do you think that the ideology of extraction worked? Because that also needed the infrastructural, I mean, setting that the government had to introduce. And another step, like railways or roadways, so for the Ravi Ahuja, he worked on that roadways. So that also took another step. So how do you connect that ecological extraction and that infrastructural build?
Thank you so much for these comments. I just want to go back to where you started with the comments on different previous works, and I should definitely also, as you mentioned, Jan Pakar's work and something more, I should revisit that. That's a very good idea. And it is in this work I'm of course quite familiar with. I worked with him in the Art State Archives for my other project. Um, when he was then working on some publications that you mentioned. So that's something, a great inspiration for me also. Um, I think it's a good idea. Like this, the call came in quite late in this project, and of course, the cotton has been seen as one of these main drivers of the expansion of the railways in this period, the 1860s, right? But as I showed in these maps, I mean, this was an idea. Also, previous literature has shown that the idea of the railways was long-standing, and the certain areas that were, subject to extraction was there in the 1830s, 40s already, and before that, of course, also. Regarding the Geological Survey of India, these very areas are also mapped in these publications that you mentioned, the memoirs published by the Geological Survey of India. And I've also seen some other earlier river surveys of the Narmada River, which is then slightly north, right, slightly further north, on how to connect those coal reserves that they find there to the railway construction, both up towards Gujarat side as well as down south. Right? So the rivers are explored, but for example, the coal fields that they find, relatively minor ones, I would say, in connection with the IPR, are relatively underused in connection with the railways. But I think the idea of it is interesting, as you think, because it is not, that coal is not initially thought of as something to extract for export. It is to bring down the cost of the railway and make it more profitable, the extraction of other natural resources. Right? So it is connected to the extractive practices are connected and they facilitate each other, because these surveys of coal, as you rightly mentioned, are made much earlier to start with, and then followed up upon when it is noticed that coal as an energy source is very heavy and costly to export and import for the railways and to also sustain. And interestingly, just recently, these papers I looked at the archives in Mumbai, the Indian coal then was of such inferior quality, according to these surveys, but not super inferior as such, because they were similarly inferior quality of coal in England also. So it was like a substandard of coal. But if you use this coal, you need much more preservation practices. You need more coal sheds. You need more extensive infrastructure to keep it. So there's this whole cost efficiency calculation of how to extract raw materials for the railways and what would benefit who, so to say. Because there are also private companies and who should build this railway to feed it. Right? So just like we see the construction of the railways, who would benefit from it? The investors, the cotton exporters, and so forth. Right? The same with the coal feeders, because they were built by the railway companies, but then also smaller feeders for the for other coal companies that were private. Right? So there's a lot of collaboration in terms of enterprise industry. So yeah, did I answer your question there in terms of the relation between the different extractive practices? And I think it is very useful, like you mentioned, to look more at what has been done in Bengal, for example. Because that's a region that has been studied extensively in terms of different ecological aspects of not just infrastructure as such, because that can be theorized as governance also as a form of infrastructure, right? If we see people as infrastructure or governance infrastructures as we talk about, right? Like, and I think that also, as I said, that 1857 even before that 1855, perhaps also the ideas of force of empire, but maybe in a more nuanced way that becomes this infrastructure becomes one way that can kind of like change the idea of security also for the state. Like, what is security for the colonial state at certain points of time, right? That changes too. And how that security is negotiated in terms of profits. Like, what kind of profits would you make by the infrastructures in this context? So, and I think if you look at infrastructural studies, there is this quite interesting special issue on what you call, I forgot the first one, but Degens is the surname. It talks about also this, that, moments of crisis and disaster also, as I'm well aware, often lay bare the weaknesses of infrastructure and how infrastructure can be changed for certain purposes. And I think that's also something to bear in mind, keep in mind here when I look at, not just the beginning of the 1860s, but the end of the 1860s, because then the cotton boom is over, and there has been a change in what is the railways there for, what is the infrastructure there for, to a certain extent, right? There's a certain, there's change in the way that the infrastructure is seen over this period also that is difficult to exactly, pin down right now, but it is definitely different if you look from 1860 to 1865 in terms of how they will be used, because it is interlinked with this global set of networks of extraction at the same time.
Thank you for the talk, ma'am. I'm Diana. We already met from a PhD scholar here. So, in one of the maps in your presentation, the one with the great cotton fields of India, I noticed something which was kind of curious to me. There's a marking called uncivilized tribes. So, in a map that marks the cotton fields of India, supplying very little to England from want of roads to the coast. What is the significance of the marking uncivilized tribes? There's like very inferior cotton, and then cotton, opium, and then there's jungle, and then uncivilized tribes. So I just like caught that caught my eye. So I just wanted to know what is the significance.
I cannot remember actually on top of my head what is the uncivilized tribes in this area. But it is slightly which
Central.
central. I can't remember exactly where it is.
It's around Orissa.
Around Orissa. I can look here. I have it here actually. Yeah. Yeah, it is basically Jharkhand, present day Jharkhand, and down towards Orissa and down south there. I'm not sure exactly what they refer to, but I can only guess that it is roughly the same kind of tribal areas that we see in Jharkhand, and that they also central provinces, right? That region.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. I can look it up the more, because it of course comes with a very long narrative. It's not, but it's really fascinating to see how much effort is being put into mapping certain areas in terms of raw materials, that it's so focused on extraction of certain things and governance, like who are there and how do we interact with them. And I also mentioned it briefly in my survey that I looked at some, for example, Mulheron has made this, tribal surveys of the area, where he is not at all interested in necessarily raw materials. It's about people, meeting people and practices and customs, but of course very, utilitarian in a way, like who are they, what do they do, and what are they good for, and so forth in their society, and what do they know, and what can we know from them. So this Mulheron, this is also the big volumes on the tribes of India, I think it is called, right? This big volume. But he has these smaller publications preceding that. So that is also very very useful to see because this knowledge is also then goes into data government reports, which is really about the cotton markets and who is who in terms of dealing with labor contractors and local people and settlements along the railways. But yeah, I also, when I started working on this project, to me it is quite a small area, but it's also an area which is rather complicated because you have this intersection of many people coming together, administrative districts coming together, so it's rather complicated to look at the Hyderabad assigned districts there are, which keep shifting in terms of borders and administration. And then also, of course, the present-day archives that host these materials are, so far it has been quite, I've mainly relied on Maharashtra State Archives for the railway documents here in this case, and also British Library and the National Archives in Delhi. So, and I think there is a lot more to take. Early on during my postdoc, I also made a visit to Jalgaon, quite coincidentally because my former supervisor is based there now at the Gandhi Research Foundation. So there I also met other historians and who have worked on other archives and so forth, and scholars from Gujarat, etc. So there are, other resources I think that can, one could easily have gone also to many more archives, and I know that for sure from my PhD research that you can find these mines, gold mines in very small archives that can give you much, more substantial material from Maharashtra State Archives. Yeah. But I will, we can exchange emails and it would be lovely to share the document with you.
Thank you, Eleanor, for just to connect it to the kind of work that our scholars do. This is exactly what I do there. Every time we have talks, I was listening to, I could see that the Indian Railway still has kind of fascinating impact of the general mindset. I'm sure you must be aware about politics going on in terms of naming trains, growing connotations of one Bharat and this train and that have a big impact especially on the Indian mindset. So while I understand that your project of the political economy of Indian Railway and their so-called, as you mentioned, the so-called civilization and the ecological cost involved in terms of setting up all fair enough, I think. But interesting on the other side as well, scholars working on the green capitalism, on modernity, colonial modernity, the connectivity to the Indian Railway is the network across the country. That is also quite interesting because this is how they could execute that connecting link across the length and breadth of India. Otherwise, not happen perhaps possible. So I think this is also interesting when we talk about the Indian Railway because we have this side of India as well. Cultural connectivity, then in terms of spreading of information, circulation of newspapers and other commodities, business and commerce. I was interested to know whether, when you mentioned that some of the contractors and the officials talked about the local resistance to the railway and the proliferation of the railway tracks through the lands. Did you come across any archival records which mentioned that some of them did flag the issues that we should not go ahead? But they were a large, comprehensive kind of endorsement within the colonial machinery that we should push ahead with a railways plan. Or were there some alternative causes within the colonial machinery? Did you come across any archival sources like that? And another thing is that since you mentioned about that archive, if I'm not mistaken, that was discovered in Axford stuff, those box. I remember Kunal mentioned about it, that was the house and that content that box. So he was from Sweden. That gentleman was from Sweden. Right? So I mean, was there a kind of transnational network of these contractors and circulation of workers? Because he came from Sweden to India to act as a railway contractor, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So what about the analogies between the Nordic experience of railway tracks and the kind of experience that you studied here? I mean, do you find some similarities there also? They encountered similar problems. But, I remember that when we talk about railways in America, there are two sorts of responses. One is the one that you mentioned and quite justified. So, but at the same time, I see that most scholars are literature students. Whitman and others celebrated the railways in terms of the locomotives, the coming of the steam engine, the Bollywood films, projecting the arrival of the steam engine. Even in Bengal, they would project the Opuk trilogy, where they see the famous scene of the railway steam engine coming here. So, of course, it has been projected as an intrusion of that colonial modernist project in the indigenous cultures where Gandhi was very much opposed to it, but Gandhi at the same time traveled throughout India with the railways. So Gandhian politics would succeed because of the railways, but at the same time Gandhi was against the railways. I could see the inherent contradictions there, but that apart, it would be interesting to know whether it would come across any archival material that shows that some colonial officials also flag the issue that we should not move ahead with that because that would jeopardize the cultural and the ecological concerns there. And the other one is how to address the Nordic experience.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you very much. Thank you also for flagging this idea of connecting it more maybe to the national. I think that's been done as a Prasad book. Where she really talks about how it changes also the social idea of time and space and mobility, right? I think that's a great source for bringing in also for me. I mentioned briefly, I think, about the Joseph Stevens as a contractor coming. It was Anglo-Scandinavian, right? So born to British parents in Stockholm, and then as a teenager he moved to Copenhagen with his family and two siblings and parents. So his father became a professor of English. I shouldn't say English literature because he was really not trained in literature, but he was a rhenologist, but he was native English teacher, right? So that was, I think, connected to his appointment. I mean, the link to his appointment there in English. Joseph's older sister got married to a British railway engineer. Abbott was his first name, who then built the railways from Roskilde, town in southern Denmark, to Copenhagen. So he was part of that band of engineers who had been properly trained in northern England as an engineer. And Joseph was then, when Abbott and this team of engineers moved on from Denmark to India, to Bombay, to build the railways there in 1856 or 55, because they experienced the Indian uprising in 1857. Yeah, that's the point. And which they also then described that they come back to Copenhagen, and then Joseph is recruited as an apprentice of Abbott, right? So he joins him as an apprentice to start with to become a civil engineer. He has this long contract with the where it says that he would be trained as a civil engineer and fed meat for his salary and so forth, right? Everything included. So that is like a good deal for him. And his sister writes his younger sister writes to him in India saying that everyone wants to send their son to India. It's like a golden opportunity at this point, maybe 59, 60. And you also have this great boom and the construction. So what I can see is that Abbott knew that Joseph was going to be able to make a lot of money, and the family did not have money. So that was like a purpose of it. So So the circulation of these engineers and contractors, yes, there's certainly a network there in place. And I think what is interesting is, of course, also that the other engineers then later on goes down to build the railways in Palestine, for example. So there are these like same engineers that move around, or their apprentices that move around different spots across the world. So that is definitely there. And what we can see that Joseph did, because the railways was not as laid out as it was in India and in Sweden when he came back in 1869. So he starts immediately when he comes back, when he is Marcussen to this day, is where the box, the document was found. He immediately starts to see how can I export timber from this region, right? So he buys a big iron estate that is kind of run down, but he sees the natural resources that come with it, this big forest, right? It's a landed estate, just what his father wanted him to buy, the landed estate, because they were not landed, right? And so he starts immediately to develop this idea of a railway line. And this is also very similar to what happened in the UK and other places, the debate between canals and railways, right? It was the same in India, should they develop the canals instead of the railways, and they decided for the railways instead. And in Sweden, canals have always been in favor in the north because there's a lot of water, a lot of forest, mainly in the northern part. And it's a very long country, right? But the northern parts are full of forests up to a certain northern degree, right? So the canals have been used extensively for exporting, for taking timber to the coast and from there on continue. Right? But in southern Sweden, there's also this network of canals. So the railway that ties together, the railway that is developed, also ties together canal networks and railway and ports. So you have the Baltic Sea and then the port in Malmö towards Copenhagen, and from there onwards to either to northern England, Liverpool, or to London. So there, he is more than geared towards exporting towards London, of course, because that's where he has his contacts in after 1869. But what Joseph also doesn't know, and it appears, which is kind of peculiar in a way, is the additional cost of exporting to the empire. Right? So there are different fees and charges involved that are not really profitable. So I would say to begin with, when he comes back to Sweden, when he returns, he tries to export to the empire, but gradually it will be more local export and local also industrialization. And this is also very peculiar, a big difference to the UK because Sweden's industrialization was much later than the UK's, right? So you have this industrialization that actually coincides with 1870s when Joseph arrives. So he arrives in Sweden when there's a boom of industrialization after the big recession of the 1860s, and especially 1967 when he buys the estate. So they're quite interesting, what should I say, analogs to the cotton boom in terms of like he can suddenly use the resources, the natural resources for exporting to other local industries in Sweden and in Denmark. There are lots of Danish farmers, big farmers who buy up land in Sweden at this point and start making wood pulp. Again, then for house construction.
Sorry to interrupt. When you talk about Nordic colonialism, does it include this study on the Nordic countries?
Yeah, I mentioned this article also in the introduction there in the north on settler colonialism and different forms of belonging that are constructed through infrastructure. We also have another professor from the Sociological University who works on these large-scale infrastructures, including the mines in the north. And this is a quite interesting also, just like in India, a very current topic, like mines in tribal lands, which is a continuation of the late 19th century practice. Right? So we have this huge mine, the largest one in northern Europe is in North Sweden, Kiruna mine and and it's currently being transferred to communities because of these, the danger of these mines caving in. Right? So there is similar studies. I mean, there are lots of interesting ways of how land use and infrastructure has changed with with the coming of infrastructure. Sorry, the land use and the communities have changed with the coming of infrastructure. But of course, also this, I shouldn't say the same as empire, but different nation states have been different territories from the Sami population that live in the northern part, right? So there is definitely a strand in Nordic colonial studies that look at how infrastructure has impacted and how tribal lands in this area have changed with so-called, of course, so-called colonialism, because I wouldn't say it is officially recognized as colonialism, but maybe nation states that would have to do something more constructive about the situation we have today. But there is, of course, a concurrent debate about this very much so today. Sorry, I completely forgot your first question. I got so much into it, but so you remind me what it was.
The first person was on kind of contradictions and related to our times that these but
Oh, yes, yes, sorry, now I remember, Yeah, definitely, there are some hesitation, but I wouldn't say it is related to the ecological impact of it. But as I mentioned also in this introductory slide, there is continuously from the 1840s or 1850s a remark about access to water in the land. That it's basically impossible for them to cross the land with cavalry for the horses because there's not enough grass and there's not enough water. So this is like very complicated to sort of say govern from the perspective of the sources. But how to how to govern the land becomes a question, but not how to stop it. They are pointing out the difficulties, and I don't think that the railways necessarily is considered being more problematic than any other mode of transport or infrastructure in the area. But water is it is always, of course, a crucial matter for infrastructural building, absolutely. But it is pointed out as a major shortage in various points. And of course, also for cotton cultivation, you need water in a certain soil base, right? Carefully mapped where it is. But in terms of like accessing the land, water is one issue. The other one would be, of course, the issue of labor. I would say would be the biggest shortage, like not having enough labor to progress with the construction. That would be the major thing that they're saying the hindrance of progression of the railways rather than anything that is pointed out. Right? But I'm sure I could find even more on water when I continue with the sources that I gather. I would be surprised if I didn't start to say, right? Because it is a really a different feature.
If there are no more questions or observations, then we will put the session to a close.
okay.
I think, yeah. Thank you very much.
We will go for a meeting at the library. So we can have on the side.